Have you ever wondered what in the world does South Africa have to do with the world that we live in today? Well, if you're interested in finding out, stick around for the next few minutes as we hang out and talk with Dr. John Webster, one of our brilliant professors right here from the HMS Richards Divinity School. Welcome to Past the Pulpit, where we dive in beyond the sermon to look at life, love, faith, and community. Each week we ask of the preaching text, what hopes, challenges, and passions lie at the heart of the sermon. Welcome to episode 5, Confession. Dr. Webster, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Real privilege to be here with you.
So you took our pulpit. Can you share with those who are listening in today, what was your message of the day?
I think the core message was that we have resources within our own Adventist faith tradition to actually address real live issues of concern in our society and today, and to share with the church the way that South Africa responded post-apartheid to the challenges of racism back then, and see if there's some lessons in some ways we can draw some insights for today.
Now, if you happen to be living under a history rock, you may not have known about the apartheid. Can you tell us what the actual experience was like?
Yeah, I mean, apartheid is defined as the attempt to legally, structurally divide people on the basis of race, ostensibly to give everyone living space, but in practice to divide and conquer. Wow. In which a minority had all the privileges and the vast majority of folk from Africa, and that minority was largely from Europe, and the vast majority of folk just being excluded from almost everything that of value in life. That essentially is what it was. And it was not just the practice of people, but the actual institutional structures with laws behind it. From 1948 through 1994.
Through 1994. And you came on the tail end of that whole...
Well, I grew up and lived there, of course.
Oh, yeah.
Then I was away for about a decade doing graduate studies, and then returned just as the indicators were there was going to be a new direction from 1991, 1992. And the first full, free, one-person, one-vote election happened in 1994.
Wow.
When we had a chance to participate in that. Just that experience was almost like a liturgical experience because, for the first time, South Africans from every walk of life standing in line to vote, a sense of optimism and hope. Of course, everyone came with their own experiences, some of them horrendous and deeply hurtful, but that sense of a new possibility, it was an amazing experience.
Oh, man. That's a historical, monumental event. Mm-hmm. Wow. Now, you were part of something called the TRC. What is the TRC?
All right. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was sort of the third way that South Africa followed to try to deal with the aftermath of apartheid. What are you going to do? And there were three options. I mean, the one is the classic Nuremberg style.
Yep.
Find the perpetrators of human rights violations and abusers and oppressors and try them according to international standards. The other, and that was favored by some, the other option was just give everyone blanket amnesty, just forget the past and go on into the future. And the problem with the latter was that you paper over the wounds and the hurt.
Yeah.
So Mandela and the interim constitution in South Africa in the early 90s, before the 1994 election, decided to try a third way. And that third way, which eventually was turned to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and it had sort of the overtones of a religious institution, although it was a secular institution of the state, was to do three things. Primarily, to offer amnesty only for folk who came up and gave the full articulation of what really happened, and if their actions were motivated by the political struggle and they made a full confession of what they did, there was the possibility of amnesty. But that was going to be treated case by case. Second, to get a full record of the whole history of apartheid, what happened. And remember, apartheid came after the period of colonialism and slavery in the past. So, this was just the latest incarnation of hurtful experiences. And then the third aspect that is relevant to us is that the Commission wanted to hear from faith communities of all different backgrounds as to their own experience, their complicity with apartheid, and what they did to oppose it, and what their vision was for the new South Africa in the future. And so I played just a small role for the Adventist Church in making our statement to the TRC. Now, I got to know the leading players involved. Some of them were my former teachers, John DeGruchy, Alex Borain, many others, but I got to know Desmond Tutu as well.
Whoa, that's huge.
And later on, we had the opportunity to take a tour group from La Sierra University, while Charles Teal was with us, to South Africa, and we actually had an appointment and met Desmond Tutu towards the end of the TRC process. He was already in failing health, but it was wonderful to meet him in person.
Wow. So I hear as part of this TRC process is the idea of confession. And in your purple time, you talked about two kinds of confession, and you tied this all together. Would you just share a little bit about that?
I think actually the use of the language of confession was rather particular to our Adventist statement. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did couple truth-telling as a way to get to reconciliation. And the Commission could demand the truth. You can't demand reconciliation. That has to happen, right? But the recognition that truth was essential if reconciliation was to happen. What we try to do is tie together the biblical notions of confession, confess your faith, confess what you believe, but that at the same time means confessing when you don't live up to what you say you believe. And so that's the structure of our statement. It was an 8-page statement, and the first part was theological. The second part was practical answers to their particular questions and a vision for where the church would go in the future. So what we tried to do was to say to ourselves, let's not just answer this thing in broad human rights language or the language of the law. Let's try to speak theologically. You know? And so we chose an Adventist verse, here's the patience of the saints, they that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus, or testimony of Jesus. Even the spirit of prophecy comes in there in traditional Adventist interpretation. So we try to take that confession of our faith and show how that also enabled us to confess the church's failings with regard to racism in South Africa at the time.
What's so hopeful about that is I think sometimes the church thinks it's very binary. Right. Either we admit to something or we just don't admit to it, because if we admit, that means we've got issues and problems.
And it's even more subtle than that. I think there are some, and it's understandable, who think that our business as a church is to proclaim the truth of the gospel and what we believe.
Right.
And that social action or concern about social things is important, but it's a secondary thing. It's something that individuals may do. What we wanted to try to do is to show that the two things are fundamentally connected. That you can't say one thing that you believe without actually understanding what the implications are for your actual practice.
Now, you did something unique in that you took the 10 Commandments and you articulated
we took each of the 3 parts of the Revelation 14:6 passage. So we reflected on the patience of the saints. I did that in the sermon. Endurance. Why weren't we willing to endure suffering in the light of the sufferings of others, right?
Right.
And then secondly, what does it mean to keep the commandments of God? And because of time, I moved over the second part. So we looked at the first 4 commandments.
Yeah.
And some people have asked, well, you skipped over the slides of the last one. What did you say? And remember, I'm quoting all of the slides up in church. We're quoting from the actual document that is now part of the public record of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from the Adventist Church.
Now, that was a specific question. Would you take just a few moments to go over the last 5?
After doing the first 4 commandments and a big chunk on the Sabbath. I mean, basically, we said you can't be Sabbath keepers and ignore what the Sabbath actually means.
Powerful.
For how we live in community, for the stranger that's within your gates, for all sorts of things, right? But the second table is respect for family, life, marriage, property, truth, and the limits that make up the second table of the law of God. Once again, we have to ask, and this is now quoting, we have to ask whether we did enough to honor the law, uphold the righteousness of God in the face of rampant lawlessness and disregard for every one of these principles in our country. Let's go through the last 5.
Let's do
Number
it.
5. How could we not have realized that to honor our parents meant also to honor the culture and traditions of our ancestors in South Africa, right? and to respect the land that they gave us. And this is a very important issue for more indigenous societies. You know, the closeness to the land, somebody came in and took the land.
Yeah.
And so we had to, that's an issue you have to reflect on. And the next commandment is the 6th commandment. Should we not have recognized in the institutionalization of systemic violence and the brutalization of the innocent a direct transgression of the commandment not to kill? So we take these well-known commandments, but then apply them to an actual current situation in society. The 7th.
I wonder if we like the ambiguity of a commandment as long as we don't have to apply it.
Yeah, it gets difficult. Yeah. 7th commandment. How could we not see that the Group Areas Act, that's the act in the apartheid system that specified, dependent on the race that was indicated on your birth certificate, where you could live. So the Group Areas Act said only some people, a certain color, could live in this group or in that group, and it was divided up into the whole group.
Wow.
How could we not see that the Group Areas Act and the pass laws, which allowed people to only go into certain areas depending on race, attacked the very fabric of family life, destroying parental and marital relationships? Just think of tens of thousands of African men who were herded into hostels in the areas where the mining was happening, and by law separated from their families, who had to stay back in tribal lands. How could that not be impacted by the 8th commandment?
Wow.
Well, that was the 7th, right?
Yeah.
The 8th commandment. How could we not have appealed to the prohibition against stealing in the face of forced removals, expropriation of land, and the exploitation of labor? So short, but we just wanted to say these commandments are not just about spiritual things, they're also about how we live and how we treat each other.
Right.
And the 9th commandment, surely the command not to bear false witness, demanded that the church speak out against lies, deceit, and distortion that became endemic in our society. For Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And then the last one, coveting, right? Do we not have to admit that we coveted security, peace, and quiet for ourselves with public respect and acceptance, rather than risk raising the wrath of the state running amok with the exploitation of the poor and the enrichment and corruption of the strong?
Mercy.
So that's just that I skipped over because of time in the actual sermon, but it's an illustration of everything we tried to do in the sermon, which was to refer back to this historical document, and to try to indicate how faith and societal action actually belong together.
Oh, that's powerful. If you happen to be listening along and you're wondering about the first portion of that, go ahead and go back. You can find it on La Sierra University Church's YouTube channel, the sermon done by Dr. John Webster, and he goes through you go through the first table. We take time.
And so what I do in the sermon is patience of the saints, endurance, willingness to suffer. The 10 Commandments, I just did the first 4, and then the spirit of prophecy, testimony to Jesus. We like to link those concepts. How could we be a prophetic movement and be blind to what was happening?
Is it possible to be a faith community that is healthy without the process of confession?
I think you can't really have truth. What I put up in the sermon was that confession is the route to reconciliation, R-O-O-T, right? Mm-hmm. But confession in the form of confessing your faults is the route. That pronounced differently. The route. Do you Americans? The route. It sounds nice when R-O-O-T and R-O-U-T.
Yeah.
The route to reconciliation.
The wordplay there is excellent.
So I think that, and it only works, unfortunately, in English pronunciation. Anyway, I think there's an intimate connection, right? Because often you don't really see what the truth is until you look at it through the lens of a practical situation. Otherwise, it just becomes ethereal.
Yeah. What do you see about our church today that you think, these are lessons we could learn and maybe use practically that would help us move forward in our community to be a better reflection of the kingdom life?
Right. I think the first lesson is that it's very understandable and very human for us to try to avoid, by being silent, difficult, challenging things.
Yeah.
So we don't want to divide people. We don't want to get political. We don't want to do various things. And I appreciate that. I do understand an appropriate separation between the realm of politics, which is about government and about making choices about how to deal with things, and the mission of the church. But many times these overlap in ways that we cannot extricate. So silence is not neutrality. It's often support for the status quo, whatever that may be.
That's a good word.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Second lesson, I think, is that there are more resources in our Adventist faith and in Christian faith in general than we think. Faith commitment, confessing the truth about God in Jesus, God with us, actually is practical. It's not just theoretical, theological mumbo-jumbo. It actually, when we think about it and ask, what does this mean? And always that means, what does this mean for me today, now, in our crisis? Not the one 25 years ago in another continent, but today, that is a critical connection.
So how long have you been here?
I came to La Sierra in 1999. The plan was to arrive a week ahead of classes, and then there was a major storm that hit. The plane was diverted from New York, and we landed in Chicago. We ended up 3 days in the airport. The hotels got booked up. So I arrived here late on Sunday evening and walked into class for the very first class, I think it was the history of Adventism or something like that, without a piece of paper, without a textbook, nothing. And just walked in and said, we're going to start in here doing history backwards. We'll start with what are we concerned about today, and then see how the past illuminates that. So January 1999. So it's actually 24 years we've been here. Wow. Amazing.
And had you always been in higher education?
No, I spent about 7-8 years in pastoral ministry. Now I was studying along at the same time. I've always had that interest.
Yeah.
But we were a pastor. Yeah. And then I was invited to go to Heidelberg College to do just one semester for an American teacher who was going back on furlough, and that ended up a whole year. And then they said, we want to sponsor you to go and study. And so I went to Andrews first, and then some of the teachers there said, look, great to have you here, but we think you should go. And they named the places where they thought I should end up. And I said, that's very nice of you, but this is not going to happen because I'm sponsored here, and they want me back as soon as possible. And they said, leave that to me. And some of them were Larry Garrity, Fritz Guy, and Stan LaBianca, many other folk that were there at the seminary at the time. And it just worked out that happened. South Africa was willing to wait because it took a little longer than it would have just at Andrews. But it was a wonderful experience to go to the East Coast and to immerse myself, and then to go back and spend a decade teaching in South Africa during these events at this time.
That's amazing. I ask these questions because many who might be listening may have taken a course or 2 or 3 or 1,000 from you, and
I think Devolt has the record on
that. Yes,
Devo.
Pastor Devolt has the record. Yes, something like 35 or 40.
It's 42, I think. But some of those were just credit things. He claims that.
Yeah,
I haven't.
He
does
claim.
Up,
yeah. And you're well known for being an academician for your classes are just known for like how, you take some classes and it's like Cinnamon Toast Crunch. It's sweet, it's tasty, it goes down easy. Then you take some classes that's like Wheat Bix. That's it's good for you, and you're just but you're having to do the work to digest. And in your classes like that, but it's good to know that you also have the background of pastoral work.
You wouldn't want to go to a doctor that kind of had a nice little, let's talk for half an hour about the human body and what makes it tick. You want somebody who's, and I say to students, look, this thing of theology is an incredible enterprise. Not only do we have 2,000 years of systematic theology itself, but we have done something about the Bible, biblical studies. We need about history. We need some philosophy. We need to understand so many other things that are going on that it demands a certain amount of commitment and interest. But to me, a boring theology is a bad theology. So I hope it's not boring. It may be tough, but we're asking ourselves, what does it mean that God has revealed God's self in Jesus, and how does that play itself out?
If you've been listening along, I'm sure you've gotten your money's worth as we have been sitting here with the brilliant mind, Dr. John Webster. Now, John, let me ask you, for someone who is not in college or in university studies, you've got your regular member who maybe, who went to trade school or who's doing a fantastic job as a gardener or a janitor. What would you say to them about one practical thing they could do that could affect our world in a positive way when it comes to this racial reconciliation?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a very important question, and it's a tough one. I think we're living at a time when many people, particularly those of us who haven't directly experienced the hurt of discrimination or been on the wrong side of the tracks.
Yeah.
I think that there is a cultural sort of mood in the country right now that says, I'm sick and tired of being made to feel bad about something. I'm not a racist. I don't, some of my best friends are such and such.
Yeah.
And that response is understandable, but it actually misunderstands a critical thing. And that is how these problems become structural. They become systemic. And to understand that can be very liberating, because it means that many individual people caught in the system have good intentions.
Right.
But these systems have a life of their own, and they entrench themselves, and it becomes extremely difficult to change them. So what can you practically do? I think the practical thing to do is to first listen. Allow yourself not to be turned off when people are sharing the experiences of hurt. Not say, oh, we've been through that. I don't want to hear any more about this. This is all woke stuff. Just listen to another human being sharing their experience. Put yourself in their shoes. Secondly is to recognize that even if you don't have feelings that you would call racist, remember that we may be part of a structure, against our will even, that actually tips the scales and makes some people's lives much more difficult than others.
Right.
And what we can do there is to become familiar with the issues, vote our conscience. It's an extremely difficult thing to change a system, but it can be done. And ordinary people who just insist on bucking the system when necessary can make a difference.
Wow.
So don't despair. And people of faith, people who confess the truth in that theological faith dimension, have a tremendous lever and tremendous ability to make the other kinds of changes, because nothing motivates us more than our sense that we have been graced by God's love, and therefore we want to be agents as part of that movement of change.
As you were talking about recognizing that there are systems and structures, sometimes I run into people who say, well, I don't believe that the structure or the system is racist, or that it can be racist. Seeing as you come from an experience where that very system was built that way.
It was so clear to see in South Africa. So anyone who thinks that, come and take a look.
Yeah.
But the difference in South Africa was there was all public knowledge. They claimed that this was all doable on the United Nations principle of self-determination. These are different peoples. Good fences make good neighbors. We're going to divide up the country, give everyone a place, not telling people that 5% of the population had 80% of the land.
Wow.
And 80% of the population were given just the scraps, right?
Right.
But this whole instinct, it was all above board. In other parts of the world, racism is more hidden.
That's right.
But it's no less structural.
Yeah.
The structures are just not as easy to see. So that's why I think South Africa can be useful, because many people thought at end of the 80s, early 90s, that South Africa was heading for a bloodbath that would make Northern Ireland look like a picnic, because there were such pent up feelings. And although it's not a picnic, it's not perfect, and there's still problems, largely corruption and the violence that stems from the liberation period of time and struggle. Once you unleash that kind of, we'll demand what we need and we'll take it at the point of a gun. It's hard to put that back in that genie back in the bottle. But nevertheless, it could have been so much worse. And so when we act to try to break that system and open it up to humanity, it's not futile. We could just go on doing this, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and where will it end?
Yeah.
And so the little piece I read at the end of the sermon from just two individuals who found each other most unlikely.
What a story.
Who lost a daughter, and the commander who gave the command to have her killed, and finding each other, breaking that cycle of violence, and trying to see the humanity in each other, understand where they come from, why actions were taken, that we're not just pure evil and pure goodness, right? There's a mix always in both, and then to try to see how can we move forward. Somebody has to have the courage somewhere to say, my commander-in-chief commands me to forgive you. Even though I don't feel it.
Oh, man, that's a word.
And the other person, who's not Christian, but an atheist, touched by that, I think, the little candlelight that points to the light, who is Jesus. He saw something and he just said, I can't go on doing this. I'm going to try to work with you for the future.
Someone might be listening and thinking, where do I start? Is there a book I could read? Is there a book or a resource that you could suggest?
Now, this may be self-serving, but I think Maury will be happy. Yeah, take a House on Fire, right? Yeah. And look through the chapters. Some are more difficult than others. Some are much more accessible than others. But I think that will be a wonderful starting point for an Adventist to take a look how Adventist scholars and theologians address this. And some of the chapters are very accessible, very easy to start. If you want to go deeper and you're bothered by the structural question, right? I'm going to suggest a book that will take some demanding, but again, multiple chapters. Some of the chapters are easy to access, and the title says it all. She's the MIT, the Ford professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. So this is no secondary school.
Yeah.
And she wrote a book entitled "Resisting Reality."
Resisting Reality.
Resisting Reality.
Resisting Reality. Okay, you heard it here. If you're looking for something good, worth reading, checking out Resisting Reality.
Sally Haslinger.
Sally Haslinger?
Haslinger.
Okay. We're going to close. I want to close with one final question to you. And basically the question is, give us your final thoughts on this. We were closing out this month. We really wanted to focus in on racial reconciliation. Give us your final thoughts. And just before that, thank you for listening in. If you are following with us, consider continuing to check out all of our other episodes. This is episode 5, and you are listening to Past the Pulpit. Past the Pulpit is really about looking beyond just the sermon and listening into the heart and rhythm of faith as it intertwines and intermingles with love and life and community. So thanks for tuning in, considering sharing that with a friend. And I'm with Dr. John Webster. We're going to let him close us off here with his final thoughts.
Yeah. I really want to thank you and the pastoral staff for taking Black History Month for February and to draw on the resources of some of the authors from that book. And many people may wonder, well, you had such 3 powerful presentations from Scripture and from people's lives, people who themselves are persons of color and have experienced discrimination. What's this white guy doing here at the end? And I didn't want to stand up there and give a traditional sermon, so I wanted to reflect on the other side of the situation. What if you find yourself like, we found ourselves as a family and as a church in South Africa, that we need to make confession not only of our faith but also of our failures. How do we go about doing it? What are the resources? And hopefully you can be encouraged that this is not a act of self-flagellation, but it is actually fundamentally tied to being the kind of Christian that we say we should be.
Praying that you are working on becoming the kind of Christian you should be as well. Thank you for tuning in with us here at Past the Pulpit. We'll see you on the next episode. Blessings.